Hi, everybody, and welcome to Devotions Today. I'd like to tell you about our daughter Philippa, who, when she went over to London, managed to find a job. She saw it advertised in one of the newspapers with a man called Nati Kirsch. Now, some of you may know his name, but he was an extremely successful South African businessman. And when he was in his early 40s, he was one of the richest men in South Africa. He was very involved in the food business. Um, he was involved in the setting up of the Checkers supermarkets and many other things. I won't go into all the details now. But what happened was one of his partners, without Nati knowing, went and did a deal with one of the big insurance companies as an investment, and the whole thing fell to pieces. The result was that Nati went completely bankrupt. He had nothing. Everything that he'd built up was gone. The only thing he could do was to go to another country because he could no longer do business here. And so he went across to the UK and he started all over again. And he went particularly into the supply of excellent food to restaurants, first of all, the UK, and then across in America, one of the biggest and most successful chains there. Then he started in security, in airports, and then he went into the property business. And his name was right up there with one of the most successful businesses in the UK. As a matter of fact, he was often just above Richard or just below Richard Branson in the rankings of wealthy businessmen in Britain. He didn't want to go to England. He loved South Africa. He did fantastic work in Swaziland. He did an amazing thing for that country. But that's where he ended up. And he made the most of it and made a great success of, of what he did. He did. Well, I'd like to point you to a part of the book of the prophet Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah had prophesied to the Jewish people that they were going to be attacked by the Babylonians and they were going to be defeated. And so best if they just gave in and surrendered and went, because that was what God had in mind for them. Long story about the disobedience of God's people. So finally that happened and they were taken into exile. And while they were there, Jeremiah was led to write a letter to all those people in exile. And I'd like to read that letter to you. And this is what it said. Just a part of it I'll read. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon: build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. God was saying to these people, make the most of the situation. This isn't where you wanted to end up, but this is where you have ended up. Now make the most of it. And isn't life like that with us at times? We don't expect to end up in a certain circumstance, but suddenly we find ourselves there. And we can bemoan the fact. We can feel sorry for ourselves. Or we can listen to this word that Jeremiah is saying. We can even take the example of Nati Kirsch in different sorts of circumstances and pray for the situations in which we find ourselves. Often in South Africa, there have been difficult times. We're going through difficult times at the moment, and many people have emigrated, often for very good reasons, and we respect their choice. But those of us who stay here, God calls us to make the most of our situations and to pray for the prosperity of our country, to do what is good here and to build it up. I heard a story of someone in our church, even today, who had been through extremely difficult times, and she ended up all on her own, and she had no money. She didn't know what she was going to do. And she said, look, I can do a few things. And she began to do them. And she began to prosper because she used the gifts that she had and made the most of her difficult circumstances. And that was such an encouraging and an inspiring story. And so we can end up in all kinds of difficulties. We can end up in financial difficulties. We can end up in difficulties in relationships. We can end up in difficulties in our business situations, in our health, whatever it may be. But in the midst of all that, God is there, even though we have ended up, as it were, in exile. And we didn't really choose to be where we are, but this is where we are now. And so we see the story of Jesus. Look where he ended up. He came as the Son of God into this world, and he brought the good news of the love of God and the salvation of God. And there he was, being rejected by the very people that he came to save. And yet, not a moment of complaint, but simply prayed for them. Even when he was dying, he was blessing the people who were crucifying him. This is God's way. And in the end, he triumphed in the resurrection. And so it's not easy. It's a tough call, but may God give us the grace to make the most of some of the most painful and difficult circumstances that we may find ourselves in. God will take us through. God goes with you, and pray that you will have a great day, a great week. Bye for now.